All right, so, first off, what is truing? Kind of a weird sounding word, and I've even seen it spelled a couple different ways, because we all know the word true, T-R-U-E. Sometimes truing is T-R-U-E-I-N-G, sometimes there's no E, and it's just T-R-U-I-N-G. I've seen both used. Truing is basically the process of turning a drape into a pattern, and it's a process of kind of connecting the dots, but as well as correcting seam lengths and smoothing out some of our shapes. And truing is not simply just coming to the dots we have and drawing a line to connect them, because going back to the idea of comparing seam lengths, things like our side seam on a skirt or a bodice, as we're draping, the fabric is moving, it's stretching, and maybe your marks weren't super accurate. So we don't just connect our dots exactly where they are. We need to be pinning these seams together and comparing them and seeing, oh, if these two are not the same length and they should be, how do we fix that? How do we equalize things, okay? So it's a very broad term that you'll hear a lot, but it includes just kind of everything in this entire process, all right? So, starting with our skirt, okay, this is what we were to drape last week. Here's our front, and here's our back. The truing of this one is gonna be a little quicker compared to the bodice because we did so many preliminary marks. We did more of our marking in the beginning, so we actually have a lot less to do on this one, but I thought it was a nice one to begin with, all right? And as I go through these steps too, I'll present them in a specific order that I usually feel is best for you to kind of, learn it and interpret it, but over time, once you kind of get the hang of it, you'll see that there's a few things that can be, done in reverse order. Some steps, one have to follow the other. Other times you'd be like, well, I could pick 3 different things to do right now. Okay, so it's not always about the order, but sometimes it is. So let's see, here we go. I'm gonna start off with something that I like to do first, just generally to get it out of the way, which is I like to come to any seam that meets the center front or center back lines, okay? So right here, this is our waistline. So where we made this little mark. Whenever you have a draping project where you've only draped half and you imagine that it's going to mirror over to the other side, if you have a seam line that is coming to that center line, we want to make sure that we have a smooth curve on the waistline or a smooth curve on the neckline, unless we're intentionally creating like a V-shaped point somewhere, like a V-neck or a V-shape at the waist. If we are not aiming for a V point and we want a smooth curve, then what we need to do is be sure that those lines hit the center front and center back at 90 degrees. We have to square them from the center lines, even for a very short distance before they begin to curve. So I like to do that now as my first step, okay? And I mentioned that in a lot of other things, like when we draw our horizontal balance line, you have to use your L square to square it because it's a very long squared line that we're creating. These are going to be very short, so you're actually okay to use your clear grid ruler to do this because we're only going to square for 1/4 to 1/2 inch in some places. So coming to my front, I'm just going to come to my center front right here. And sometimes rather than matching the end of the ruler, I like to match any of the other numbers, like I'm lining up my number 1 line. So that just makes this edge of the ruler be square. And I want to put it right where I have my little mark. And yeah, my mark roughly looks square, but I want to make a nice, sharp, precise line just like that for about 1/2 inch, okay? So now I'm sure that that's a true 90 degrees where it meets the center front. It'll cross to the other side and we'll have a smooth curve rather than a point right at the waist. Same thing for the back, okay? So I'll just match one of my lines with the center back and have the edge where my mark is, but give it a nice defined squared line like that. And just a little side note too, on pencils, I usually prefer to use a softer lead pencil when I'm making my markings on fabric. I can't remember if it was this group or my Monday group where we did talk about pencil leads. Did we talk about the B-H system? Cool. So I have a 2B right now. I'm using a soft lead pencil, so see how nice and dark my marks are. But the downside of the soft lead pencil is they also get dull very quickly. And you want your lines to be nice and sharp and precise. You're going to be graded on stuff like that. If your pencil work is real thick and mushy and blobby, it may take a couple neatness points off. So you will see me sharpening my pencil like mad just to make it as sharp as possible along the way. All right, so that's done. Now I'm gonna move on to the side seam. Our side seam on our skirt, The lower portion from the hip level down is already drawn. That's this solid line that we drew all the way to the bottom. So that one's already complete. But our little dot markings here indicate the upper portion from the hip to the waist. We're gonna draw that in using our hip curve ruler, appropriately named, right? And other markings, like when we come to the waist, you'll see that what we do is look at our little dots here and do our best to sort of average them. You don't always just want to directly connect the dots because then it'll be like, okay? On our hip line here that we're about to draw on the side seam, you're almost gonna sort of semi-ignore the little dots you have because I'm gonna tell you the exact curvature of the ruler to use, and it may miss some of your marks, okay? So starting on the front, I'm gonna hold my ruler like this so that the straighter portion is down and it's curving upwards toward the mark that I made at the waist. And I wanna have the 15-inch mark matched right here at the top of the solid part of the side seam, right at my horizontal balance line. Okay, so I'll have the 15-inch there, and my ruler will curve up, and I'm looking to have, it should be around the 7-inch mark, meeting the mark you have at the waist. So just like this, I'm now going to draw the side seam, just like that, and it should blend really smoothly into the straight portion. This is now our completed side seam. We'll do the same for the back, so I just flip my ruler the opposite direction, and our goal is to always be sure that it has the exact same curve. So you want to use the same number positions on the ruler for this one. So I have my 15 down here, and it's kind of roughly going over the dots, but I want to hit my mark at the top, right around 7. Okay. So see right here, my dots were kind of way in. Here they're a little bit closer. Sometimes when we're draping the skirt, this just means that maybe the fabric was pulled a little too tightly across this area because this curve is kind of a standardized shape. So that's why we just went right off the ruler, even if it misses some of the dots. Okay, next thing we're gonna do is we're actually gonna add our seam allowance to our side seam and cut it out. Some of our truing things, it's easier to just kind of wait to the end to add your seam allowances. This one, it works a little more nicely if we add it as we go. And again, we're kind of turning this into a fabric pattern, so that's why we need to factor seam allowance into it as if we're about to sew the garment. Different seams on different parts of the garment will have different standardized seam allowances, and the standard seam allowance for a side seam is 1/2 inch. So I'm gonna add 1/2 inch to both of my side seams. Coming from my front all the way down here, that just means I put my 1/2 inch line right on the straight part of the side seam and outward from it. I'm starting all the way at the bottom of the fabric. I'm adding my 1/2 inch. And you'll get the hang of marking on the fabric too. You want to avoid having your pencil skip over it. So you want enough pressure that it leaves a line, but not so much that you drag it and get like a skippy line. That was easy because it's straight, but now coming up to the curve, I kind of have to keep pivoting my ruler by a little bit and making a series of shorter lines that will blend together. So I'm using a straight ruler to make a curved line is what's happening. But I want to just be drawing as far as I can before the 1/2 inch is no longer matched to my line below. So it's just little pivots. The steeper the curve, the more you pivot your ruler. This is kind of gentle, so I'm just gonna go right up like that. And I just kind of overdrew it at the top. So there's my 1/2 inch seam allowance. And now I'm gonna do the exact same thing on the side seam of the back skirt.
Could you make dots and then use the hip curve to like add the 1/2 inch seam in the end if you wanted to?
You could in theory, but even that would take a little bit of practice because sometimes if you did this, you can't use the exact same curve and move it outward to connect your dots because it's almost like circles when you stack them inside one another. When you get to a bigger circle outside, it's actually a less tight curve. So it sometimes gets to be a little tricky, but once you kind of know what you're doing, you may find a way that you can use that technique and it could work. At the end of the day, as long as you end up with a super even 1/2 inch, then if you find a different method, that's totally cool. Okay, so there's my straight part, and coming from the opposite direction, when I switch sides to not have to rotate things around for you all. Sometimes I do things at weird angles, but I'm adding the same 1/2 inch. Just like that, all right? And I'm gonna go ahead and cut the fabric on that 1/2 inch seam allowance line. That's why I kind of overdrew it at the top, way past the waist, just so it gives me something to follow as I'm cutting. Now you're gonna have a lot of grading criteria on these assignments. Cutting is one of them. That means as you cut your seam allowance, you want a nice, smooth, accurate cut right on your line. Okay, there we go. Now the other one.
Sorry to ask again, but what is your opinion on like more like the pizza cutter roll, like cutters?
Ah, the rotary cutters.
Yeah.
Love them. The school hates if you use them here because we don't have cutting mats on the table. Yeah, they just don't like the wood tops getting brutalized, but I use them a lot at home, more depending on the type of fabric I'm using. I kind of like using my shears for like medium to heavier weight fabrics. I actually feel like I have a lot of control with them, but definitely anything more delicate or stretchy like knits, silks, shears, it's all about the rotary cutter because then you get a more accurate cut when your fabric isn't kind of lifting up from the shears being under. All right, so there's our 1/2 inch seam allowance added. Now, what we're gonna do is we're gonna start pinning our side seam closed. We're not gonna pin the entire portion of it. We're gonna begin by just pinning from the hip level down to the bottom, all right? And in doing so, I'm gonna introduce to you the criteria for pinning while you're truing. There's a lot of really obnoxious little specifics with it, okay? So first off though, to pin a seam together, my goal is to have my actual seam lines matched up, not the seam allowances. So the best way to do that for this is to take the seam allowance on one of the pieces and fold it under, and then we match the fold to the other pencil line. Now, as far as whether you fold it under on the front or the back, does not matter. I always just like to have some sort of continuity when I'm teaching those, so you'll always see me pick the back. So I'm gonna come right now to my back, and I wanna carefully and accurately fold that 1/2 inch underneath. So I'm folding right on the pencil line that I have, okay? So this is the bottom, this is the straighter portion. So that's kind of straightforward, but guess what? Once I hit my horizontal balance right here, horizontal balance line, it's gonna become curved. And maybe with paper you can't, but with fabric, yes, you can fold it along a curve. So just do it in kind of small little sections. And I just kind of, I lost my line. I was folding on the different line. There it is. I'm just folding that excess under. I'm really just kind of finger pressing it exactly on my pencil line. Okay, so when we look at it now, see my fold is right on that side seam. And I'm gonna bring it over now and overlap them. So I'm matching the actual seam lines of both pieces. All right, and don't worry about the upper portion where they're curved yet. You're gonna start your pinning at the hip level where your horizontal balance line is drawn, and you'll go down to the bottom from there. So for your first pin, you wanna really make sure that those lines are perfectly matched. That's key. Make sure this is a straight line across. I do have to rotate it to be at a better pinning angle as I do it, but I think we'll still be all right. Okay, so to pin, rule number 1, your pins always need to go perpendicular to the seam line. Same is true when we sew, okay? So I wanna make sure I'm matched right there, and my pin will go perpendicular, or basically horizontal, sideways, however you prefer to look at it. And I'm gonna work my way down, and these pins need to be placed roughly every 5/8 to 3/4 of an inch apart. That's close, that's a lot of pins. It's way more than we use when you're sewing, but that's how many it takes to really kind of keep things lined up when we're truing a draping project, and keep the fabric distributed nicely. So just a couple tips on that. I always like to fill the time as I'm doing this. I usually like to put the point of my pins in really close to the fold. So rather than pinning over here in that direction, see, I'll come right here, get the pin in right near the fold, and you really only have to pick up a little bit of fabric. In fact, it's actually better if you don't scoop up a big wide area. Okay, make sure the fabric is nice and smooth between each pin as you go, and really be sure that as you work your way down that your fold doesn't start to overlap the line too much. That's also things to be graded on. Basically, are the pencil lines exactly on top of one another as you pin, okay?
So when you pin to true it, you don't do the top and the bottom and then go in the middle?
Nope. So yeah, it's very different than sewing. So when we're sewing a garment, we assume that our pattern is already perfect. We assume that our seam lengths are exactly the same. And we don't want the fabric to have one layer stretching more than the other and make it seem like they're not the same. So we assume it's perfect, we match up our endpoints and let it work itself out in between. With draping, the whole process of truing is to sort of check our work and make corrections. So if something is off, we want to see that they don't match up at the end and make our correction there. So certain points we are sure to match, like the horizontal balance line, but for example, even though we're going to create a hemline here, you'll see when we do the side seam on the bodice, it has a top and bottom where either point could be incorrect. So we don't want to force the end points to match and then we'll get a bubble of fabric in the middle. We want to see if something doesn't match and correct it, but that is a great question. Okay, so yeah, I'll get my mojo going and I'll try to pin even faster during our talks here, but hey, when I'm pinning is also a really great time for questions. Okay, all right, so I'm going right about down to the bottom here. Oh, that moved. That's what I used to mark my video area. Hopefully it's not too far off. Okay, so here we go. I pinned the bottom of the side seam. And we did this because we now want to draw our hemline all the way across. We don't want to draw the bottom edge of this piece and the bottom of this piece while they're separate. We do it while they're connected so that we know it'll match up and be continuous going all the way across. So to draw the hem, we first need to establish the actual length of this skirt. And I'm not sure if you remember way back on the first day, but I did point out that this is going to be an 18-inch long skirt. So that's going to be our length. And we're going to measure that length along the center back. So, back and front lengths can actually be very different on a garment because the waist will hit at slightly different angles. So you're going to measure this length from the center back waist. I'm going to come to this point, measure down, and hey, look at that. I have an 18-inch long ruler. So I'm going to come right to the bottom and make a mark for the length at the center back. Then we take the L square, and I want to hold it so that I'm squared to the center back, and we draw our line straight across to the other side, all the way across the side seam until it hits the center front, all right? So make sure I'm all lined up, and I'm at my 18-inch mark, yeah. All the way. Okay, that's the bottom edge of the skirt. While we're here, we're gonna add our hem allowance, just like the seam allowance. As if we were sewing this, we need some extra at the bottom to fold upwards to create a hem. We're gonna give 1 inch of hem allowance. So I'm gonna draw a nice line that's exactly 1 inch below this one that I already have. So let's see, about 1 inch, that's the middle line on the ruler. And be sure you're adding this below your initial line, not above it. There's my hem. While we're at it, I'm gonna cut. I'm gonna cut on that hem allowance line that I just drew. All right, so next up, we are going to be doing, let's see, do we want to do the upper part of the side seam or, no, I think we need to do our darts first, actually, okay? So we're going to be truing our darts directly onto here. When we drape this, it's almost like we just kind of created pleats. We just had a little fold of fabric and you just saw this kind of loose pocket coming down below. And that's because creating a dart at the exact length and angle, we just do that directly on the fabric with our rulers. There's no need to try to pin an entire dart in place. So that's what we're about to do. All right, so to create our darts on the skirt, let's just review a little bit of kind of our dart terminology. Up at the top here, see these little spaces between the marks? That's our dart excess. That's the space within the dart. And as we draw the dart in, it's going to look like two lines that come down and meet at a point. Each of the lines are called the dart legs, and the point that they meet at, which is basically where your little sewing line would end, is called the vanishing point of the dart. All right? So we're going to need to draw all of those elements in with very specific measurements. What I want to do first is I want to find the exact center of each dart, because I want to draw a guideline that sits exactly in the middle. All right, so I'm going to come to my front. Here's where my two darts are. There's those little spaces where we pinched it closed. I want to measure that dart excess, and remember that those two darts on the front should be the same size as one another, and the two back darts should be the same size as one another. I have 3/4 of an inch, so I'll make a little mark at 3/8 right in the middle, and I'll do the same thing with the other one, okay? So there's the center of my front darts. Same thing for the back. These will be the same size as one another, but they're clearly much larger than the front, so let's measure. My back darts are 1.5 inches, so I'll mark the center at 3/4. Same thing with the second one. Mark it at 3/4. Next, I'm gonna come to all 4 of those marks I just made, the ones that are right in the center of the dart, and I want to draw a guideline that extends straight down to our horizontal balance line, and those lines should all be parallel with the center back and with the center front. And the best, kind of easiest way I find to do that is to actually square them to your horizontal balance line. I'm going to use my L square. I'll have the bottom leg on my horizontal balance line, and then this should be coming right up through the center mark that I made. Okay, make sure it's right on. And I can even draw this from way up here, right? So there's the center line extended straight down, parallel to the center back. And I'm just going to repeat this technique at all 4 of my center marks. Now I'll move over here to the front. I don't like going across the pins. Let's turn it this way. Okay, center lines are established. We drew all these because as we try to find the vanishing point, which is kind of like the tip of the dart, it should sit exactly on the center line. This is what gives us the angle of the dart, so we know that it's not veering off this way or veering off this way. So what we need to know next is the length of each dart. And for this isn't something that you figure out in the draping process. This is a standardized measurement, and that's even used in pattern drafting if you were to draft the basic skirt. So I'm going to give you the exact measurements for the length. Your 2 front darts will have a length of, let me flip it to right, they will be 3.5 inches long. The 2 back darts will be 5.5 inches. 3.5, 5.5, okay? So how do we go about doing that? We're gonna come to our front. Let's do the front darts first. I'm gonna come right here to this little mark. This is right where my first dart leg crosses the waistline. This is where my measurement is going to begin. I want to draw a line from there that is 3.5 inches where it meets the center line. This is making the leg of the dart be 3.5. So see how I tilt the ruler right there, okay? Here's my 3.5 inch mark, okay? There it is. And then rather than doing that same trick again, plus, see, you can even see the waistline sits a little higher over here. The second dart may kind of technically end up a little bit longer, but what we want to do is have the vanishing points be at the same level. So once I have that first measurement, the 3.5 from here to here, I'm just gonna use my L square and see if I matched it to center front and match it to the mark, I can come right over this line and make a second mark that I know is level with the first, okay? There we go. So if I took this measurement, again, it may be a little bit longer, but it just means that the bottom point of my darts, as you see it on the skirt, they'll end level. Now I just come in and I draw the dart legs. This is the fun part. I'm gonna start right from my cross mark for the first dart leg, where it's at the waist, angle my ruler so that I draw right down to my mark, which is the vanishing point of the dart. Give it a little angle to come up to meet the other mark. There's my dart. But while we're on it, what I also like to do, which will help when we fold them closed in a moment, even though they're coming up to meet this mark at the waistline, I draw them all the way to the edge of my fabric. It'll help when we're pinning, okay? So now I'll do the same thing with the second one. I just come from either of these points down to the mark that is my vanishing point. The trick I like is to hold my pencil at the vanishing point and then pivot my ruler on it. It makes it so that your vanishing point is real sharp and doesn't crisscross or angle off real weird. Just extending that one again. There we go. So now we're gonna move on to the back darts. Same idea, but we're just gonna make 5.5 inch length instead of the 3.5. So I like to establish the length of it on the first leg of the first dart. So in that case, it's this one right here, closest to center back. I want to angle my ruler so that my 5.5 inch measurement will meet that guideline I have at the center. There it is, okay? So it's 5.5 from here up to the mark for the first dart leg at the waist. Just like before, I can now just use my L square to, I am having a problem with, this is kind of tilting in a little bit. I think the fabric becomes a little unblocked when you leave it sitting sometimes, so you come from up here actually, this is better. All right, so see I'm square to center back, matched up with that mark, mark the second dart at the same position. And now we just draw in the dart legs from our marks up here at the top. So from this first dart leg mark, you just come down to the vanishing point and back up to the other side. Same thing for the second. Okay, so there we go. Darts are drawn. And again, they really only need to go to the waist, but I just extend it to the top, makes it easier when we're pinning. We are going to be folding these darts closed and pinning them in the same tedious manner that we did on the side seam, but first we need to put a very special mark on them, which granted isn't totally necessary when we're just making a fabric truing, but it's a mark that will end up on a finalized pattern. Later on in the quarter, we'll be doing this whole process on paper, and a paper pattern needs to have the vanishing points of the darts marked with something called a drill hole. Maybe you remember back to industry sewing. In your sewing notebook, you had a couple darts that you had to sew, or you kind of folded your fabric to bring the two angled lines together and you sewed to make a point. So the purpose of a drill hole marking is to show you how far down to sew, how far into the fabric the dart goes. But the thing to always remember is the drill hole marking is never at the actual vanishing point of the dart. Reason for this is, as you saw, when you sew, you take your awl and you mark the drill hole by poking an actual hole in the fabric. And if our stitch line only went exactly up to that hole, you would still see a visible hole at the bottom of the dart from the outside of the garment. Therefore, this marking that we make always needs to be inside the area of the dart. And that distance that it will sit inside is always the same. It is 1/2 inch, okay? That means I'm gonna mark drill holes on all 4 of these darts, and all of them are going to be not at the vanishing point, but a 1/2 inch back inside the dart area. And a drill hole is marked by basically just marking a little dot and drawing a small circle around it. So let's see, if I come to this first one here, the drill hole should also sit on the center line of the dart, so that's another good reason it's there. There's my vanishing point. I come up 1/2 inch on the center. I do a dot and a little circle, okay? See, it's above the point. Do the same thing for all 4 of the darts. 1/2 inch above the vanishing point, dot and circle. Same thing on the back. Regardless of the length of the dart, the drill hole position is always the same, 1/2 inch from the vanishing point. All right, our darts are done being marked and trued and all that jazz. So now we have to go about the super fun process of pinning these closed, okay? We're gonna be using the same general pin spacing that we did on the side seam and having them perpendicular to the dart, to the seam, which is also perpendicular to our darts. And when we pin these closed, we have to begin our pinning down at the vanishing point and work upwards to the top, all right? So I'm gonna start with the back darts. They're a little easier just because they're a little bigger. These are kind of tricky just to get started. So looking at our back darts, we know that our dart excess needs to go towards the center line on the inside of the garment. So I'm gonna come to the first dart leg, the one closest to the center, and I'm gonna fold my fabric on it. Only from the vanishing point to the top. I wanna try to carefully crease the fabric right on that first dart leg. Okay, see, I folded it right on there. Oh, my fold's a little off from here. Here's another folding trick. You can actually just bring it in this direction. Okay, so it's folded. While I'm at it, I'm gonna even go ahead and crease the next leg of the next dart in the same manner. So did the first leg of this dart, now I come to the first leg of the next dart. I'm also gonna fold it. I find it's easier to do both of them before all the pins are in the way, so that's why I'm taking this approach. Okay. There we go. So now looking at this one, the goal is to bring this folded dart leg over to meet the other one, just like this. But there shouldn't be any fold happening below the vanishing point. So you don't want to let all this start to come over. Your fold and your overlap should only be from this point up to the top. So see right from here. Okay, and get that lined up. And we're going to start pinning all the way up. I'm going to rotate it because on the back, this puts me at the better angle for me to enter my pins on the fold side, which I really like. Now, as far as where to put this first pin, you'll never be able to put a pin like way at the actual vanishing point. There's so little overlap that there's nothing to actually grab with the pin, but you got to start pretty soon. So I always say a good point for your first pin is right at your drill hole marking. It's 1/2 inch up from the bottom. It's right about at my drill hole. Put the pin right on the fold, and again, these first ones are the hardest, but you want to make sure that you actually are pinning that fold. See, when I pull it open, it's staying in that pin shut position. And now I'll just work my way up. Still the same kind of 5/8 to 3/4. And really be sure that the pencil lines for your dart legs are nicely matched and they're not overlapping too far. I don't like that pin there. Okay. Fun, huh? Okay. Okay, so when I get right around here, see, I'm right at the point where the waistline marks are. We're gonna need to draw past that. So I usually like to get my last pin, you know, kind of close, but not directly on that mark, because it'll get in the way of us drawing our waistline. So maybe I'll put one here, and then I'll skip over this area and just kind of come all the way up to the very end of the fabric. This is why I drew my dart legs to the end. I like to just kind of secure it up at the top. Even though it's kind of outside our draping area, it just keeps everything lined up for a little further so it doesn't try to pull open. Okay, cool stuff. Let's do the next one. Okay, so I'm gonna bring this first dart leg over to meet the second. And all right, let's see. Can I speed up my pinning game? Grab two. Okay, so I got kind of close to the waistline marked, but I'm gonna skip over it and just come right up to, way up to the end and put a little helper pin up at the end there, right? So here's my two back darts pinned closed. Woo, now the front, okay? So for the front, let me turn it to face you again. Same idea, but they're basically gonna face opposite direction because these ones need to go towards our center front. So I wanna grab the dart legs that are closest to the center front. Those are the ones that I'll fold the fabric on. Okay, that one's, okay. So these are a little harder to pin because they're skinnier, but hey, they're shorter, so they may go a little more quickly. All right, fold it on the dart legs. And close the dart by bringing one leg over to the other. Try your best to start your pin around the drill hole at least, and work your way up. All right, that wasn't too bad. Okay, skip over the little waist mark area and just put an extra one at the top. One more to go. Okay, my fold got a little off track from the line, so just a little correction. Almost done here. And last one up at the top. Pencil line's not correct. There we go. Okay, so ta-da. Here's my darts, all pinned closed. While they're like this, kind of take note of what some of your markings look like up at the waistline, okay? So here's where you did the little cross marks to mark the waist and the princess line. You'll see that the top of some of your darts, they do not match, okay? Most of them don't match for mine. This is why we're doing the process the way we're doing it. If I just had my skirt laying open and I kind of drew the waist between all those areas and then drew some darts in, we would have dart legs that are not the same length when you actually sewed the garment and waistlines that don't match. So we have to pin it closed and then we'll be correcting all that. All right. Thought I was somewhat done with the pinning, but we have one more part to pin before we can draw the waist. We're gonna pin the rest of the side seam closed, all right? So we did the darts first, and again, we just talked about why we needed to pin them closed to be able to draw the waistline smoothly and correct what's mismatched. Same is true with our side seam. Right up here, this is where I drew my mark to say this is the corner of the side seam meeting the waist. These may not actually be the exact same length as one another. So that's where we're gonna pin up to the top, and if there's any discrepancy at the top, then we'll correct it, and we're gonna draw the whole waistline across everything while it's in this pinned position, okay? So, it's starting to get a little wild because it's getting a little three-dimensional here, but you still want to do your best to keep your fabric nice and even and smooth between the pins. And be sure that you're really matching the pencil lines of the side seam, which is gonna feel a little tricky because it's curved, but let's see. Sometimes there's nice ways to adjust it. I go like that. Ooh, that's nice. That angles everything in a little more. Okay, so even though no one expects you to use a ruler to measure your pin spacing, that will be part of the grade as well. You know, roughly in that kind of 5/8 to 3/4 range. Basically, they just can't have like a big 2-inch space and then two really close and all sorts of angles. You just want them as evenly spaced and parallel to one another as possible, okay? Oh man, I'm actually kind of disappointed because I think my side seams are matching pretty well. I'll probably have plenty of problems on the bodice to work out and show you, but yeah. So as I'm coming up to my waist, I'm looking at these two marks and they're actually matching up pretty nicely, but yours may not. So let's talk about that after I kind of get my last pin in here. Sometimes on other ones, I almost purposely make my marks a little funky just so we can have things to discuss in terms of how to fix problems. Okay, let's see. Ooh, that helps. Okay, so now I'm looking at the whole waistline and just taking tabs on all these little cross marks going across here, okay? And actually, I'm gonna say that this is not a perfect match up here at the waist. My eyes see this one a little bit lower than the other. This one's a little higher. So this is where we start to discuss if you have to make a correction, which one do you fix? Which of these marks is correct? How do you know? How do you fix it? And this is a good first example. So when in doubt, if you have two seams that aren't the same length, you refer to your dress form, okay? So I'm gonna show you how to do this. So this is a number that I have memorized, and over time you will as well. I'm gonna take the actual measurement of the side seam from the waist down to the hip level. That's exactly the part that we're looking at here, okay? Usually on most of these, it should be about 8 1/8 of an inch. Remember that. From the waist to the hip, 8 1/8 for a size 8, okay? So just to check that, see, I want to see what is the actual seam length here to here. Oh, this one's a little short. This is almost exactly 8 inches. Yours may be 8 or 8 1/8, okay? But I'm gonna go with the 8 because I think that's the one I draped on. Now I know all of you, as you're doing this at home, you may not be sure. Wait, am I putting this on the same dress form as before? As long as it's either 8 or 8 1/8 and not like way outside of those numbers, then that's just fine. So feel free to use either one if you're making your corrections at home and can't measure a dress form. But what that means is I'll come to my drape and measure from the hip up to the waist and see which one of these marks is the actual number I'm going for. So if I measure right from the hip level, coming up my side seam and adjust it, okay. I'm seeing that this one is right on the 8-inch mark. This one's a little bit less. So this is the winner, this is the loser. That means that as I draw my waistline across the side seam here, I want to catch this mark, but this one is going to be raised up a little bit so that they match. So here's how we kind of do that. Thank you. As you're doing all this, you're never going to be able to draw like the whole waist or other seams in one fell swoop. You're usually using multiple positions on the ruler, but it's going to involve the hip curve ruler for all of this because the waistline is not straight, it is curved. I want to first start by making my correction here at the side seam. And again, I know that this side is correct and this isn't. So I'm just going to find the curve on my ruler right here where I matched with the correct mark, and see it ends up coming a little higher than the incorrect one. And it's not going to follow the whole waist in either direction. I'm just going to mark 1/2 to 1 inch to either side, just this little part that passes the side seam. So I want it to look like it can blend into the dots if I continued. So see, I'll just about like this. Okay, so see what I did there? I made sure that I made a line that was totally continuous as it passes over the side seam. That's my old mark that was wrong, right? Now, as I draw the rest of the waistline, here I am just kind of trying to average the dots as best as I can, but I know that as I come and draw my front waistline, it's got to blend nicely with this line that I already have drawn, as well as blend nicely with my little squared line right here. And in doing this, you'll also see you don't have to do the same measuring trick to correct the little discrepancies at the top of the darts. From here, we just draw a smooth curve. And for most of you, you'll see that your little dart markings at the waist have to come up a little higher for you to get a nice curve anyways. I don't want it to point downward at the darts. So if I was to show you how that goes, I'm actually gonna start over here at the center front. I make sure that I keep that little squared line. And see here, I'm following most of my dots, and then it comes up a little higher at the darts. You wanna average as many as possible, but sometimes you just have to ask yourself, what makes sense? Do I want a waistline that goes or just a whoosh? So I'm on it, here it comes a little higher than the darts. And now as I come over to the side seam, I may have to find a different spot on the ruler, but that looks nice. See how I blend nicely between the two parts I already have? There. Whoosh. Sound effects help. Now I'm gonna do kind of the same thing coming over from the back. So I wanna come off of that squared line, follow as many dots as I can, and draw a nice smooth waistline that passes cleanly over the top of the darts. See here, I'm getting a lot of my dots. Last little bit. Okay, so now just kind of take a look at what we're looking at here. It should look like a really smooth curve all the way, all right? And see, it doesn't get all the dots here. It goes down a little too much, but I just know I want a nice swoop. So that's still what you're ultimately aiming for. And I know that now my side seams are the exact same length because I drew the waistline over them while they're connected. The last thing we need to do for our skirt is we need to add our seam allowance at the waist and cut it. And then that'll actually be it for the skirt, okay? So our waistline on our skirt, let's see, this direction. Our waistline is going to get 1/2 inch seam allowance, okay? So the same amount we added on the side seam of 1/2 inch, we're now gonna add 1/2 inch to the waist, and that goes above the waistline. We're adding to it. So it's a much steeper curve than we dealt with on the side seam. So it's gonna be a lot of kind of short lines and little pivots of the ruler. Sometimes they're just little short feathery lines that blend into one another. Okay. And be sure even as you end with your seam allowance that last little bit is kind of finishing squared to the center front and center back so that we keep up that shape right on the fold line. All right, there's my waistline seam allowance, and now I'm gonna cut the excess away on that seam allowance line that I just drew. There we go. Now, before I just real quickly show you how you present this on the form, which I'll review next week when you are going to be turning this in, one thing we want to do is, now that I trimmed that away, remember how I kind of didn't pin too close to the waistline here because I needed to have room for my pencil to come through? Now, if I was to pull this open, see right where my waistline is, the darts sort of start to separate, and it's making my waistline look larger than it is. They're pulling open. So I want to either add or move a pin so that my final pins are exactly on the seam line of the waist. That's what's gonna keep it all together exactly where it's supposed to be. So I'm gonna come back here and like right on the waistline, I'll put a final pin at the top of each dart. And the top of the side seam, see how that's kind of wanting to separate because I don't have a pin there. So make sure you go back and have a final pin exactly at the waist seam line on everything. Okay, so now see when I look at the side seam and the darts, nothing is pulling at the waistline. That mark all stays together. And there you have it. That's our completed skirt.